Hi everyone. Today we're going to be learning about a new type of function, and that's called a square root function. So our objectives for today are going to be able to identify square root functions and their domains, and to graph square root functions. So what is a square root function? Well, a square root function is a function whose x term is under a square root sign. So this right here is x term. So some examples of this might be square root of x, y equals square root of x, because our x term is indeed under a square root sign. Other examples might be y equals square root of 3 plus x. Our x term is still under the radical sign. Another example might be y equals square root of x plus 2. That constant term does not have to be under the square root sign. A non-example would be something like this. Square root of 2, let's say y equals square root of 2 plus x. This is not an example, since our x term is not under a square root sign. All right, so what do the graphs of these look like? What should we be expecting when we graph these? Well, it's going to look like this. We're going to have something that starts off kind of steep and then narrows off like that. Or we're going to have one going in the opposite direction like that. Or we can even have them flipped over the x-axis, so they look like this. They still start off kind of steep and then narrow off. And something like that you might also see. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about them. Okay, so our first objective today is to evaluate a square root function. How are we going to do this? Well, we're basically just going to solve an equation. And we're going to solve a given equation at some x value we're given. So our first problem here is to evaluate the function y equals 2 times the square root of x plus 5 at x equals 4. So if we're trying to find, if it tells us evaluate, we're trying to find the y term when x equals 4. So all we have to do here is plug in x equals 4. So let's rewrite this, but instead of x, we're going to plug in 4. So y equals 2 times the square root of 4 plus 5. Well, 4 plus 5 is 9, so this equals 2 times the square root of 9. We know that the square root of 9 is 3, so this equals 2 times 3, which equals 6. The main thing to remember here is that we can't multiply this 2 by anything in here before we evaluate that square root. So we need to evaluate the square root of 9 before we multiply by 2. So we can't multiply, we can't have square root of 18. We can only do square root of 9 first. All right, let's do one more example. So in the second example, we want to evaluate the function y equals the square root of 8 minus 2x at x equals 2. So we're just going to plug in 2 for x, and we'll get y equals the square root of 8 minus 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, so this equals the square root of 8 minus 4. Square root of 8 minus 4 is going to be the square root of 4, which equals 2. So y equals 2. All right, let's move on to finding the domain of square root functions. Our second objective is to find the domain of a square root function. Let's take a step back and remember what a domain is. A domain is the set of all possible x values of a function. Basically, all of the x values that make the function work. And we want to do this because it makes it a lot easier to graph square root functions. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're simply going to set the expression under the square root sign. So anything under the square root sign, we're going to set that to be greater than or equal to 0, and we're going to solve for x. So let's do an example. What if we have to find the domain of the function y equals the square root of x plus 4 minus 3? The minus 3 here is not included under that square root sign, so we're not going to use it in finding the domain. So all we have to do is set x plus 4 to be greater than or equal to 0. And now we want to solve for x. So we simply have to subtract 4 from both sides, and we get that x is greater than or equal to negative 4. That's our domain. So x is all values bigger than or equal to negative 4. All right, let's use this and graph some functions. Okay, our last objective for today is to graph a square root function. How are we going to do this? The same way we've always graphed. We're going to make a table of values and plot points. So our example is to graph the function y equals 1 plus the square root of x plus 2. Now, before we start, there are a few steps that are a little bit different from graphing other functions. The first one is to find the domain of the function. Find the domain. Our second step is to make a table of values according to the domain. I'll show you what that means in a minute. Our third step is to plot the points that we have in our table. So let's do step 1 on this guy. We have y equals 1 plus the square root of x plus 2. So we want to set only this part greater than or equal to 0. So we're going to do that up here. So we have x plus 2 is greater than or equal to 0, and we want to solve for x. So we subtract 2 from both sides, and we find that x is greater than or equal to negative 2. Now, I want to make a table of values according to my domain. So my domain tells me x is anything bigger than or equal to negative 2. So it doesn't make any sense to start this table with something smaller than negative 2. So I should definitely start at negative 2 and work my way up. Everything greater than or equal to negative 2. So I'll have negative 2, we'll do negative 1, 0, 1, and 2. Now I want to find my y values. So if I plug in negative 2 for x, I'm going to find that negative 2 plus 2 is 0, square root of 0 is 0, and 1 plus 0 is 1. I'll let you do these on your own if you want to kind of take more time to do these out, but I'll save time here and tell us what these are going to be. If I plug in negative 1, I'm going to get 1 plus the square root of 1, which is 1, so I'm going to get 2. If I plug in 0, I get the square root of 2, which is about 1.4. So here this is going to be 2.4 with plus 1. Plug in 1, I'm going to get the square root of 3, which is about 1.7. So this is going to be 2.7. And if I plug in 2, I'm going to get 1 plus the square root of 4, which is 2. So this will be 3. All right, so now I have points that I can graph. So my first one is at negative 2, 1. My next one is at negative 1, 2. Next one is at 0, 2.4. Next one is at 1, 2.7. So I'm kind of slowing down here, we can see. And 2 is at 3. So my function is starting to kind of look like that. And that is what we want to see. It starts off steeper, and it gets shallower and shallower as we go on. All right, so that's basically it for square root functions. I'll leave you to try the problems at the bottom of your guided notes. Thanks for watching.